Hey everyone, welcome. Thanks for coming to our panel on climate refugees. I won't belabor the point at all. I think you've heard that term several times so far in the conference, but I do want to introduce our panelists and the process. So what we'll have is each of the panelists will talk, give a presentation and some commentary, and then we'll open it up to questions afterward. So members of our panel in order include Dr. Susan Crate, who's a professor of anthropology in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at George Mason University. She's an environmental and cognitive anthropologist working with indigenous communities in Siberia since 1988. Her recent research is focused on understanding local perceptions and adaptations communities make in response to the effects of climate change. That agenda has expanded to Canada, Peru, Wales, Kiribati, Mongolia, and the Chesapeake Bay. She's the author of many articles and books on sustainability and climate change and has served on the American Anthropological Association's Task Force on Climate Change. Next we'll have Carlos Hernandez to my left, who holds a master's degree in urban planning and policy from the University of Illinois at Chicago and a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from Southern Illinois University. He's a former director of the Department of Economic Development for the City of Chicago and a past recipient of the Chicago Community Trust Experience Leader Fellowship. For over 20 years, he's served now as the founder and executive director of the Puerto Rican Arts Alliance here in Chicago. This is a nonprofit community organization dedicated to preserving Puerto Rican culture by maintaining and promoting heritage traditions, arts, and education. More recently, they've been engaged in the ongoing efforts to assist Puerto Rican peoples affected by Hurricane Maria. Following this, we will have Orlando Portalatin to my right. Orlando is a Jesuit scholastic here at Loyola University. He holds an MBA degree and an MS degree in industrial and organizational psychology. He's originally from Puerto Rico, and he has been in touch with affected peoples who've been displaced by the effects of Hurricane Maria. In particular, we had planned to bring Mr. Jesus Ivan Melendez, president of Quality Technical and Beauty College in Puerto Rico, to tell his story, but travel arrangements for him fell through at the very last minute yesterday. So I will turn it over now to our first speaker, Dr. Susan Crate.
Thank you very much for coming today, and I'd like to also thank everyone who made this conference possible. It's very exciting to be here. How many of you were at Gina McCarthy's talk last night? Okay, so I feel very free to expressing myself completely about things in general. So one question I want you just to hold in your mind is, what is a climate refugee? Okay? I'm not going to ask you to answer it. I want you to just be kind of thinking about that, because this is obviously this is an idea that we're contemplating in this session, and we'll come back to it at the end. So as Dan said, I am an anthropologist. I've worked with communities in northeastern Siberia for 3 decades, and in let's say 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, they started asking me about issues that I knew as a scientist were related to climate change, but that were their observations based on a very deep and intimate knowledge of place. So Dan asked me to just give an introduction to the sort of academic approach, let's say, to climate change. I came about it very naively. People started talking about it and asking me, and so we did a specific project focused on what they were seeing, how it was affecting them, what they thought was causing it, and et cetera. And so I'm going to give you a sense of that and then move into the issues of our panel in terms of health and other issues. So my research in northeastern Siberia, you can see here, this is Russia, the largest country in the world, 1/6 of the world's land, and then part of it is this huge area called the Saha Republic. Here's a close-up of that, and this is where my research is. It's about at the Arctic Circle, and it's the home to a Turkic-speaking peoples called Saha, and they live along the Vlui River, so they're called Vlui Saha. This is what the landscape looks like. As you can see, it's very flat. It's a permafrost landscape with circular lakes bordered by hayfields that transition into a boreal or a taiga forest. Turkic ancestors of the Saha came here in the Genghis Khan period from southern Siberia, and they settled here because of those lush hayfields and brought a horse and cattle culture with them and adapted to, as you can see, a very extreme climate, over 100 degrees Celsius annual temperature change. My entry into looking at climate change with them was when 10 out of 30 elders told me that the bull of winter was no longer arriving. So in their understanding of how the world works during the winter, when there's 3 months of snowless, deep, dry, cold, the bull of winter has arrived. And in the last decade or two, as the winters have become less extreme, the bull isn't arriving. And when I heard that from 10 out of 30 elders, it occurred to me how important it is for us to understand not only the physical effects of climate change, but the cultural effects. How is it affecting people's orientation to their world? And we're talking about people who have a whole different understanding, people who've been living in one place for all of their lives and maybe for generations. So their orientation to how the world works and how their lives work is based upon this place. And that place is now changing, not only physically, but their understandings and ways that they describe that place, like the bull of winter, is also changing. So as an anthropologist, I was extremely interested in investigating that and understanding that. So we did this project. We had people talking about change. We didn't use the term climate change. We just had them tell us about the changes they're noticing. We did focus groups, as you see here in the top picture, one-on-one interviews in the bottom picture, fleshed out these ideas of change and found these 9 changes the majority of people agreed that they were seeing. So let me just tell you about a few of these. So the seasons are arriving at the wrong time. In this place, when the temperature is below freezing 24 hours a day, people have a free freezer outside. And so that's when they slaughter their animals. And they hang the meat in an unheated shed outside. It stays frozen. Now that the winter is arriving late, they have to wait another month. It means they have to feed the animals another month of hay, and they have to go without their meat stores for that period of time. Another issue, as this fall season changes, there's freezing and thawing. Instead of a steady, cold freezing, it thaws, it freezes, it thaws, it freezes. Lots of issues with this. One of them is that when they gather the berries in the fall and they put them out in that shed with the meat to freeze, they freeze and thaw and turn to mush. So these are little details, right, about life and how people have adapted to a specific ecosystem that you wouldn't know from the air. You wouldn't know unless you came into this community, into this setting, and understood how people had adapted. The land is water. This is also a huge issue. If any of you have ever cut hay before, you can quickly see this is not a very good hayfield, right? It's a little too wet. Well, yeah, that's right. This hayfield wasn't like this 10 years before. This fence here is to keep the horses out from eating the hay after you've stacked the haystack. And the reddish tinge to the hay grass is showing you that reeds, aquatic grasses, have come in because nature abhors a vacuum and it will adapt to the conditions. So this is a big issue for people who raise horses and cattle and depend on hay. Here is the government's attempt to drain the hayfields, which obviously doesn't work because it's a relatively flat landscape. So these are big issues. Here's another issue. Once flat areas are falling and rising because the permafrost under the ground is the kind of permafrost most susceptible to warming. And so people who have long experience on the land, like this cowboy who told us about what he was seeing, are witnessing the change of the landscape right before their eyes. And then these are pictures I took after not being in the field for 3 weeks, when I noticed there was a particularly large amount of water on the land. And then we come to the villages and people start talking about it also. And the thing I want to focus on in this quote is the fear that this brings to people. This is critical to understand. And when we're talking about health, we can't just talk about physical health. We have to understand the mental health issues of a changing landscape, of a changing homeland, and then, of course, of relocation from a homeland where you've lived your life and generations before you. Another issue I think is incredibly important to remember is that when we're talking about climate change, we're not just talking about climate change. We're talking about all kinds of changes that these populations are in the midst of. And I think with our very local cases of Puerto Rico that are coming up with our other speakers, we'll hear a more close-up understanding of other changes. When you go and talk to people in these places, often the first thing is not climate change that they're going to tell you is difficult. They're going to talk about the difficulty they have feeding their families. They're going to talk about the lack of jobs. They're going to talk about how their young people are leaving the rural areas for the urban centers. So there's a lot more to it. And my research in Siberia and in other rural areas also showed that it's what I call a complexity of change. You have to understand how all these factors of change are interacting. And as I compare it to other places in the Russian Arctic, herders and foragers and hunters and fishers are confronting these same issues in terms of a changing climate, but also changes from economic globalization and youth out-migration. Another project that I worked on in Labrador, Canada, where we see very similar changes also. We hear similar narratives about the winters, about the change, from people who all their lives have witnessed and have a deep understanding and knowledge. And we see what I call ice dependence. So dependent on an ecosystem that itself is dependent on water in its solid form. Once that water in its solid form, or ice, starts to degrade and melt, the ecosystem undergoes a rapid change. Another project closer to home on the Chesapeake Bay, where we talk to traditional crab and oyster harvesters who, as you can see in this this map of the eastern shore. These red areas are the areas that are the most susceptible to sea level rise, which are going underwater as we speak today. And these men are observing it, they're telling it to us, they're also telling us about how their young people are not learning the traditional oyster and crab harvesting practices, and how their lives are getting more and more challenging because of globalization. I am featured in a documentary on climate change where we go to several places around the world to show the local witness and testimony of how climate change is affecting people. And I went down to Matthews, Virginia, that's near the coast, and did a screening of the film and did a Q&A. And after I answered several questions from the audience, I asked the audience what kinds of issues they were seeing. I found this is a very valuable exercise, especially working in a community where most people in the audience know each other, where they see each other from day to day. An older man raised his hand and started talking about how the shoreline was receding, how the water was coming up into the forests and killing the trees, how the land was getting fragmented by water that was rising. And as he spoke and told me these things, I could see about 10 heads in the audience just constantly nodding up and down. This is what everyone is seeing. And the next morning he took me around, as he said, took me for a tour, as he said. I'll take you for a tour. And he took me for a tour for 3 hours, and we drove all over the place, and he showed me what he'd been seeing. And he took me down to the lighthouse that used to be connected by land but now is on an island by itself, and showed me the map that showed where it was connected. And then took me to see the historical marker that says, standing at the end of what was once the southernmost peninsula in Matthews County, now surrounded by water. So these are changes that are happening in our own backyard. And the woman who hosted me to come there, when he mentioned the last place he wanted to take me to show how the shoreline was receding, she got all excited. Karen, she said, you know, this is so fun because she's 35 years old. I haven't been here since high school when I would come here with my friends to drink beer after school, right? And she couldn't wait because she hadn't been there for so long. And then we arrive, and she stops the car, and she's looking out and pointing at those white caps far out there and telling me that's where the beach used to go to. And she turned off the car and got out, and she stood there and looked out at those white caps in disbelief for 20 minutes. And it occurred to me that I don't have to talk to elders anymore about change. I can talk to 35-year-olds. That's how fast things are changing in our own backyards. So the anthropologist documentary took us to 2 other places. They asked me, where else should we go besides the Arctic to show people how changes are happening? And I said, well, we have to show the sea level rise story, and we have to show the unprecedented melting of glaciers story. So we went to Kiribati, which is one of the many island nations in the South Pacific that are going underwater. And we met wonderful, wonderful people who live in a beautiful, absolutely beautiful place. I put this picture here to show the man out in the water who is standing where the meeting house used to be, the big meeting house on this island. And you see the sandbags that they're using to try to keep the water off the island. And you see the coconut grove in the lower right-hand picture that used to be a coconut grove. We went to the Andes in Peru to get the glacial melt story. Again, a place with vibrant culture, vibrant communities, but who depend upon the glaciers for their water. Not only the people in the mountains, but Lima, Peru, the huge city on the coast, their entire drinking water supply comes from those glaciers that are going to be gone in 2030 if we don't change what we're doing. We met with elders who used to go up and get ice, sacred ice from the glaciers, and they no longer go. You can see the receding of the glaciers. Wales, who would have thunk it, right? Good old Wales is having issues with climate change, a very rural agricultural country with unprecedented precipitation and out-migrating youth. Youth have no interest in doing what their parents did. And of course, undergoing some economic issues as we know it. And then a project that I'm working on now in Mongolia. Mongolia's huge climate story has to do with these intense winter storms that used to come every 100 years and now are coming every 6 or 7 years. They're called zuds. This is an artifact of climate change hanging on the wall. These are small pieces of animals' ears that died in this extreme zud. In 2006, there was a zud that killed 6 million animals. And 1/3 of all the herders went out of business because they were right on the edge at that moment, and this pushed them over the limit. And where did they go? To the urban centers, into the poverty. So anthropologists are taking a big role in climate change. Maybe it's clear to you that we have some specific tools of being there, of being on the ground, of understanding local ways of knowing, local predilections of being in the environment, etc. We published a task force that is on PDF online. You can easily access it. And then I wanted to put this up here too because obviously McMichael is telling us that humans in the past, how have they, as we can go into our archaeological understanding of how humans have lived through the climate changes of the past, Modern societies, although larger than the past societies, better resourced and more interconnected than the past, are less flexible. So if you think about it in this country, the way that we depend on these extensive systems of food, extensive systems of water, extensive systems of energy. Just think about the last time you lost power from a big storm and how that completely threw you off schedule. And think about these areas of the world where people are like Puerto Rico, which we are about to hear about, who have, to this day, many people still don't have power, correct? Right, okay, so these are huge issues that we're dealing with today. What is the US government? Well, we heard from Gina McCarthy last night, of course, that the EPA is still in one piece, or at least a few connected pieces. It's still there. I mean, she gave me hope that everything hasn't been undone. And I want to also just say that the United States Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP as it's known, is also still there. I'm not going to go on to this website. I encourage you to look at it, though. The impacts of climate change on human health in the United States, a scientific assessment. There is some very good information that's still there, and USGCRP still funds me to be a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that I'm working on. So there is still some semblance of things happening in our federal government, and it's not going to go away. And of course, we know that the Pope is very active in this. The new Pope, who is a Jesuit, right? Okay, is a Jesuit. Sorry, I'm learning a lot while I'm here. But it does make a lot of sense that this is not equity and environmental justice and poverty has a lot to do with being vulnerable to climate change, and we know this for a fact. In fact, the World Bank probably 10 years ago said climate change is, in developing countries, resulting in higher mortality rates. In developed countries, it's costing more money. So basically, in developed countries, we have the funds so far to buffer ourselves from this. But I would argue that we need to look carefully at that. And as Gina McCarthy emphasized last night, we have to take everyone with us as we move towards sustainability. And the only way to do that is to think about the marginalized and the poor. And then this book that just came out by Todd Miller, Storming the Wall, which brings up all kinds of new issues, okay? When we think about the immigration issues in our country, but we also think about the mass migrations of humans. And we might be thinking these mass migrations are due to war and conflict, but if we look deeper, I promise you that those wars and conflict have to do with water and other resources, food, and a lot of it has to do with climate change and the way that we are becoming more and more vulnerable to issues like that. So Miller makes this great argument. The same corporatized elites who resist climate change measures like the Paris Agreement will benefit financially from its increasing ill effects. That's a problem. That's not right. That's not ethically or morally right. So let's just come back, and these are pictures I just grabbed off the web of Puerto Rico. But I think, it gives us a sense of sorry? I'm sorry? How urgent it is. It's urgent, right? Puerto Rico. Are you responding? You're giving me words to say. These are pictures to show how urgent it is. Thank you. I appreciate that. But the question I asked at the beginning, what's a climate refugee? Who has any thoughts? Let's have a, yes. Okay, fair enough. And I believe that that's the way that it's mostly used. right? Anybody have any other ideas about how we can think about this concept of climate refugees? Yes?
I sort of take exception to the use of the word refugee because there is a clear definition of who is a refugee. And when you're making, and we need policy for climate displacement, and the complexity of conflict and climate that come together really show us how much we need policy that is not there. And most of the humanitarian organizations are not mandated to work on climate issues. And so within the definitions of what the humanitarian organizations are doing and what is going to be needed as far as climate displacement is concerned really needs to be thought out very clearly. And so that's why I mean, that's the reason that I question the use of refugee for climate displacement right now.
Right, right. And, you know, I also agree with you on many levels because I think that, well, number one, I also know from my own personal experience with people who are forced to move because their island, homeland is going underwater, which Kiribati people are doing.
There's 40 islands, there's 40 places that can go underwater.
Exactly. For them, it's a matter of dignity. They don't want to be called a refugee. So that's another issue too. And I get your point about policy and humanitarian organizations and their objective to, you know, whatever is in their protocol, what are their, you know, the issues that they need to respond to. And how do we put climate in there? In what way can we put that? Especially since it's such a politicized term, right? But when Gina was talking last night, it occurred to me that actually we're all climate refugees. If we use that terminology to mean people who are being displaced by what is happening to our climate in the 21st century, it's just that we're not feeling it as much as the people that we're actually seeing are having to relocate or are moving, right? In the process of losing the basic resources that they need to survive in their homeland. So it's just something to think about because in a way it's true. And the points that we've come across here about the extensive resource, the dependence we have on extensive systems in our country gives us a sense also that we need to relocalize our lives. We need to think more about how can we become more community focused, how can we reconnect with our communities, with each other. There's a lot of work that's actually happening in this country. We don't hear about it on the news because it doesn't sell. But there is good news about what's going on. But we also need to be responsive to what's going on in the rest of the world. And because we generate 25% of the greenhouse gases that are causing this issue in the first place, part of the answer is for us to rethink how we're living and to have clean lives. And I'm probably going on much too longer than I should.
I think we're at a good point
Okay.
right here.
All right.
We'll
So
have
I'll give
questions
you
later.
a picture of some yaks from Mongolia, in case you've never seen a yak. They're pretty cool animals, I must say. And I thank you very much. Oh, wing it. You know what
Okay,
you're talking
so I'm going to do it without the notes, so I get a pass if I mess up. So when I was asked to do this, I said, well, I'm not a climate expert. I don't know climate change, and I was convinced that somehow or another I can share my professional and my personal experiences with Hurricane Maria and how it affected the people that I work with. So I'm going to try to do that this afternoon here. But before I do that, I want to sort of give you an idea about my presentation. First, before I get into the whole idea of Hurricane Maria, I want you to, I put together a brief history of Puerto Rico, very, very brief. I'd like to also talk about migration trends in Puerto Rico, pre and post Hurricane Maria. And then I'd like to talk about the Puerto Rican Arts Alliance, the organization that I work with, and its response to Hurricane Maria. Following that, we'll look at the effects that Hurricane Maria has had on Puerto Rico and the local Puerto Rican community and beyond. And then finally, we'll look at what Puerto Rican Arts Alliance is currently involved with addressing the impact of Hurricane Maria as it relates to the Puerto Rico's artistic community, and how we're going to be helping that particular sector, because we are a cultural arts organization. Oh, that one goes by. Okay. So, very basic, right? So in case people don't know, where's Puerto Rico located? It's in the Caribbean, next to the Dominican Republic, and it is the lesser of the major Antille Islands. And it's next to it, you have the U.S. Virgin Islands and Antigua and all the other smaller islands that you see there. The island itself is 100 by 35 miles wide. And some people don't know this, but Puerto Rico also has smaller islands next to it that some of them are inhabited by residents, including Vieques, who you may have heard about in the past. There was military installation practice there at one time. There was a major uproar at one point to remove the military operations there because of the effects that it's had on people. Culebra, Culebrita, Palomino, and another island called Mona and Bonito. The first part is the first invasion of Puerto Rico. Before the Spanish came in, this island was inhabited by Taino, population that was estimated, it was said to in the chronicles, Spanish chronicles, estimated between 30 and 60,000 Taino people. Puerto Rico, by the way, was at that time, the indigenous name was Borinquen. The Spanish quickly wiped out most of the Tainos. They did that either through bringing diseases that were foreign to the indigenous people, or actually, enslaving them and having them work in the farms that they created. So they ran out of labor, and they started bringing in slaves, and so these slaves were used to produce cash crops for the Spanish crown, and sugar cane, ginger, tobacco, and coffee was one of them. There was an independence, and there continues to be, to some degree, an independence movement in Puerto Rico. Ironically, under Spanish colonial rule, Puerto Rico experienced varied levels of economic and political autonomy over the centuries. There was a movement of independence. Today, Puerto Rico probably has less autonomy under U.S. rule than it had when it was under Spanish rule, because you have to remember the Spanish were there for over 500 years, and the Puerto Rican identity started rising, and they wanted more autonomy, and that was granted. As a matter of fact, it's my understanding that the Puerto Rican people had parliamentary representation in Spain, in Spain Parliament, something that we don't have today with the U.S. government. But this independent movement that was happening in South America and in other colonies of Spain reached Puerto Rico. And by 1868, Puerto Rico experienced its first uprising, or one of its first uprising, in a town called Lares. And this is frequently referred to El Grito de Lares, the cry of Lares. It was a great moment of national pride, and about 600 people attempted to uprise, and they did, and soon thereafter, that movement was squashed by the Spaniards. Fast forward, another invasion, right? American invasion, the sinking of Maine, and they created the Spanish-American War. And in 1898, Puerto Rico is invaded by the U.S. forces, and shortly there, that war was very short-lived, and shortly thereafter, a Treaty of Paris was signed, and consequently, Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, Cuba to the United States. A lot of people don't know about Cuba, but Cuba, by the way, was one of the islands that had its independent movement much more further advanced than these other islands, and consequently the United States had no other choice but to accept an election in the presidency of Cuba. Some would argue that it was another way of U.S. Maintaining control, because they were involved with looking at who would be the next president and controlling the president of Cuba. But it was, but all these other islands, some of them, the Philippines, subsequently gained independence from the U.S. So, what did the American invasion bring? Well, in 1900, the Forecourt Act was passed, and it provided a civil government for Puerto Rico, and again, while it provided a civil government for Puerto Rico, it was very going backwards. The Puerto Rican people had much more considerable autonomy under Spanish rule than it did under this new government. Fast forward to 1917. A question always asked, right, when this hurricane happened, are Puerto Rican American citizens? Well, yes. In 1917, the Jones Act was signed by U.S. Congress, giving Puerto Rico its first Senate, bicameral legislative assembly, and a commissioner, a resident commissioner in Congress who has no voting power. The idea was to get something comparable to a senator, but there's no voting power there, because there's no real teeth behind the resident commissioner. Coincidentally, that's following that, U.S. enters World War I and drafts, creates a military draft, and Puerto Ricans were drafted to the war, and subsequently afterwards they've been involved in war. The picture you see there, by the way, are the Borinqueniers, and I don't know if you heard that they were honored the Congressional Gold Medal of Honor last year or 2 years ago, and many Puerto Ricans are very proud of their American heritage and the contributions they made to protecting the U.S. Puerto Rico, USA territory, independent movement continues. In March of 1937, there was another uprising. This time, the Americans ruled Puerto Rico, and about a number of people, 19 people got killed, 200 were badly wounded, many in their backs while running away. This was called the Ponce Massacre. In 1946, the President Truman appointed the first Puerto Rican-born governor, Jesus Piñero. Piñero established this law called La Ley de Mordaza, the gag law. And this law prohibited Puerto Ricans from raising their flag for 7 years, singing any patriotic songs, talk about independence, and any fight for liberation of the island. Many people were in prison subsequently thereafter. It was like a witch hunt. And we won't go into that history, because that history is, there's a good book called The War on Puerto Ricans. If you want to know more about that, you can read about that in that book, and talks a little bit more about what the consequences of the gag law and the movement of independence movement in Puerto Rico. Now what I'd like to talk about is, now that we've looked at this, I want to talk about the migration. We talked about migration and how white people move, and early migration in Puerto Rico started happening in 1910, and by 1955, over 700 Puerto Ricans had arrived in the United States. By the mid-1960s, more than 1 million had arrived. The Puerto Rican people, while they were U.S. citizens, their experience in migrating to the United States was very similar to any other immigrant. They had language barriers, they were discriminated, and it was, they obviously came to a different climate that they did not know about, and they had to make some big adjustments to stay here in the United States. There was a period of time during the 1970s where many of the people who came here in the 1950s, where the big migration, wave of migration came to the United States, decided to go back to Puerto Rico. There were disillusion with the United States, gangs, drugs, social ill problems, and they were felt nostalgic about their country, and they just felt that culturally this wasn't their country, and they went back. But so now if we go into the 1900s and in 1990s, I'm sorry, in 2000, you will see that the net effect of the population in Puerto Rico was increasing. 1970, they returned, many of them returned, but then the population continues to tick up until the 2000s, where the population in Puerto Rico reached 3.8 million. People during this time were then began to leave after the 2000 because of a decade long of economic recession, and the birth rate had also decreased. Many of the Puerto Ricans settled in Florida and other parts of the states. Now, the Pew Research Center, provided me some more statistics that I wanted to share with you, and that was as the population peaked. The population kind of peaked in 2004, and the territory lost 446,000 people. In 2016, nearly 12% of the population was lost. In 2015, you see here alone, 89,000 Puerto Ricans left the U.S. mainland. So why were they leaving? There's a little pie chart there, job-related, economic downturn in the island, family household issues, some people retired, housing, and other. And I wanted to present these statistics to you because it's important that you understand also the migration that was already happening in Puerto Rico to the United States pre-Hurricane Maria. And here comes Hurricane Maria, right? In September of 2017. Hurricane Maria hits Puerto Rico. My office gets involved because we're a Puerto Rican organization, and the people my phone starts ringing off the hook. What are we going to do? And as you've probably seen in the news, some people responded by trying to get food aid and medical supplies to Puerto Rico. There were challenges with that. I personally didn't want to get involved with any of that, so what I did was at that time, there was an earthquake that happened in Mexico City, and because that happened, and I know people in the Latino community, we joined forces with the Mexican community, and we decided to put together a relief fund called Chicago for Mexico Puerto Rico Relief Fund. Never did this before, my first time, but I thought it was going to be a good idea, and it was, to do a response and show to the world that we were involved in raising money for the victims of Puerto Rico and Mexico. We raised $250,000. 50% of that went to Mexico, and the other 50% went to the balance to Puerto Rico. Now, if I can remember my notes here, what I had here, this is me in Puerto Rico delivering the money, donating the money to 4 institutions, nonprofit, non-governmental institution. One was the Red Cross, and the other were other 3 smaller nonprofit organizations. Getting right into the Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico has had a long history of tropical storms. However, none of them were like Hurricane Maria. Hurricane Maria, and when I visited the island, was described as a power wash. It power washed the island with winds recorded by the National Hurricane Center of up to 150 miles per hour. So you can imagine that happening to your home where you live at for hours and hours and hours. In past hurricanes would sort of brush along the coastal lands. It would particularly hit one town or 2 towns, but never a hurricane that would come smack in the middle of the island. And this one did it. When I visited Puerto Rico in December to donate this money, this is mid-December, right? About 60% of the island still had no power, many citizens without running water. Those who had power still experienced ongoing blackouts. Then there were the electrical plant generators that were operated by gas. And so as I was sleeping in my room or traveling around the island, all you could smell is the fumes of gas and how awful that was to sleep. And I only was there for 5 days, 5 nights. Imagine the people that were living there months and months, and some of them still experiencing this. Traffic lights were not operating properly, so I tried to make sure that I was at home before sundown. There's no reliable phone internet connection, so I made sure that if I had to communicate with my office, I would go into sort of a Wi-Fi hotspot or something so I could get that connection, because that was the connection wouldn't be at the home where I was staying. And hospital, we're still running on electrical generators. And here you see a picture. You kind of stole my thunder from the pictures they were showing, but there are a lot of pictures on this Hurricane Maria, because remember the last major hurricane that hit the U.S. coastal line was Katrina, I believe, and cell phones weren't around, and videotaping wasn't as readily. There's a bunch of photos about the effects of Puerto Rico, and here you see people with collecting running water here and being creative about it. Some of that they were using for washing clothes, some of that they were using for drinking, and probably they're still going to feel the effects of that, long-term effects, health-wise, as we move forward. This is me when I insisted that we were donating this money, and I wanted to get a first-hand experience on delivering relief aid to the victims in Puerto Rico. This is a small town in Toa Puerto Rico, and we were escorted by National Guard. And it was a collaboration between a local nonprofit organization that we had donated money, and the National Guard was escorting us into these different towns. And they actually, it was it's like in the movies. There was a convoy of military trucks in front of us and in back of us. Because you remember, there's no traffic lights. People are still out there, and things are still kind of iffy. But when I got to this town, I was just emotionally struck by people telling me that, in Spanish obviously, that I was the first one that they had seen since Hurricane Maria, and that they were grateful, and they were just crying that we were out there responding to with the hurricane relief aid. Current situation in Puerto Rico post Hurricane Maria. And I get this information because I have some family, I have people that I work with in Puerto Rico. An estimated 33% of the island still remains without power. The power grid remains not reliable. So while CNN probably is reporting to you that Puerto Rico has 75, 95% power already up, power is not reliable. People can't still buy food at the local grocery store, put it in the refrigerator, because they think that they don't know if it's going to spoil them the following day, because that power may not go on for 7 or 8 hours or the next day. Many companies are still leaving Puerto Rico. There's a lack of job opportunities. There are citizens returning to the island, but many are still leaving the island. There's lack of housing for victims and lack of proper care, and school closings is happening. And the migration challenges, the storm causes for evacuee are there. You have affordable housing here as they come to a new place where the communities need to absorb them. Those challenges are very daunting, right? Because you have to provide affordable housing, health care, jobs, education institutions need to absorb the new youth and children that are coming in. There's cultural connections that you have to make. Some of these people are facing discrimination. There's language barrier. While in Puerto Rico, the second language is English, still there's a preference with Spanish, and Spanish is very much the language in Puerto Rico. There's a strain on local municipalities to address these needs. What's happening in Chicago? So people get displaced. And this is not that far away from here, in Humboldt Park. The Puerto Rican community, there are challenges here. When we try to absorb a huge migration because of this climate change, or this hurricane that can be attributed to climate change, most of the Puerto Rican community lives in the northwest side, Humboldt Park, for the last 30 years. The Puerto Rican community in these communities have been diminishing due to gentrification and displacement. But yet you have this community coming into Chicago in what is still traditionally the Puerto Rican community in the Humboldt Park and northwest side, communities in the northwest side. The displacement issue has been happening for the last 3 years. Property now is very expensive in Humboldt Park and in the northwest side, with condos averaging between $450,000 and $750,000. The migration's coming in. These people need affordable housing. They have all these social ills, and they're coming to our community for help. And if they can't find it, they'll go to other communities, but other communities don't even know these people that are coming in. So there are all kinds of challenges. The picture I'm showing you here is a welcoming center that the mayor of the city of Chicago, along with Congressman Gutierrez, put together to try to streamline the migrants and the people that are coming from Puerto Rico. And here you see another picture of the processing that takes place. This is the picture on the bottom here. I took this picture with one of my colleagues. He's actually the director of the Philharmonic Orchestra in Puerto Rico. I'm doing a project with him, and I told him, this is in the Humboldt Park Welcoming Center, where people are being processed. And I said, stand there, because I want to take a picture of the people behind you that are waiting to get processed. Look at their faces. Their faces are like, what's going to happen here? Where am I going to go? So it's very, very sad. The question now continues to be, how do we continue to serve this community of need? And so in that, I want to just close in saying that how can Puerto Rican Arts Alliance continue to serve this community in need? We are a cultural arts organization, and we've put together another fund called the Chicago Puerto Rico Artistic Vitality Fund. By the way, I should say the first fund that we put together that raised $250,000, none of that was taken or accounted for in terms of administrative fees for any organization. That money was completely turned over to the nonprofit organization that are involved with relief and long-term recovery work in Puerto Rico. This new fund is to address the artist needs. And so I said to myself, if I'm going to continue to make an impact with the people that I work with in Puerto Rico, I should stay within an area where I know more of, right? Because it's Puerto Rican Arts Alliance, it's a cultural arts organization. And the artist community has been devastated. You can imagine the venues that they are accustomed to performing are down, they're destroyed. Puerto Puerto Rico is basically a 70% maybe tourist market or 60% tourist market. And so these artists are affected. So what we said was, let's create this Vitality Fund. We'll raise money, and we will attempt to bring artists from Puerto Rico, visual, performing artists, and use Chicago as a world stage for artistic performance, contract them so that they can have money and they can have some economic relief to bring home and take care of their families and live with some economic means. So I'm sort of doing that with this Vitality Fund. We've gotten one anonymous donation to do this kind of work, but the work still continues. Lastly, what I wanted to say is I did bring some brochures with me here, and we're celebrating our 20th anniversary. And in this brochure is a calendar of activities. Our first activity, incidentally, is happening next Thursday, where we're bringing the mayor of San Juan, Carmen Yulín Cruz, at the Chicago Cultural Center. And we'll have her here with her, giving her an award, a women's award that we're putting together. But should you want to be involved with our organization, know more about what we're doing, I have a brochure that you can come up and get after this discussion is over with. So I think that was all. Thank you very much.
And our last speaker, Orlando Portalatin.
Good afternoon. I promise that I won't take more than 10 minutes, probably less than that. What I want to do is I wanted to draw on our Ignatian tradition a little bit. And we have this thing called the composition of place. And what the composition of place is, it's a way for us to use our senses, right, to enter into this thing that we call contemplation. And the reason I want to do that is because, as you have heard, we've been talking about climate change, of course, but at the core of the climate change issue, there's people. And I was not in the midst of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, but I did have family members in Puerto Rico. So if you allow me to guide you through like a 2 or 3 minute contemplation of place, that'll be great, so you can actually feel and understand a little bit better some of these issues that some of these individuals faced in the island. You have an 88-year-old, an 85-year-old couple that have been married over 60 years. The night before the storm, bunker down into their bedroom because government officials have told the population in Puerto Rico that this is going to be the most catastrophic storm that the island have seen in over 80 plus years. This couple in their 80s wake up the following morning at 6:30 in the morning, and they're awakened by roaring sounds of wind coming through their bedroom window. They hunker down, they hug each other, and they stay in that place, in that position, for close to 12 hours when they experience these winds roaring through through the window, and they started like hearing transformers explode. They could hear the cracks of wood in nearby houses coming apart. After 12 hours of difficult situation, a difficult moment, they finally come outside into the balcony to get a first view of what has happened. Catastrophic destruction, as you saw in some of the slides, that has caused over $95 billion in damages. No electricity, no running water. Two or 3 days later, food supply starts to become a lot more scarce. This 88-year-old gentleman jumps into the car with his wife, drive across town in the midst of roads that are cluttered with debris, no electricity, it was chaos. Finally find a place where they can buy some food items, stand in line for outside for 2 hours, 90-degree weather, 100 or close to 100% humidity in a tropical island in the middle of the Caribbean. A week or so pass, running water still scarce, no electricity. They need to start doing laundry. They, of course, continue to go and drive every day to the supermarket nearby that has limited supply, standing in lines for a good 3 hours a day to get water so they can not only cook in a propane gas burner, but they can also start doing laundry. And you have an 82-year-old lady doing laundry by hand, and that lasted close to 50 days. That was mom and dad who were in that situation for close to 50 days. The reason I wanted to share that is because we talk about climate change, we talk about all these issues, and we're so grateful to the scientific community, but it's not just a scientific issue, right? It's a human rights issue. When it touches the lives and the livelihoods of people, it's not just an environmental issue. It becomes a humanitarian issue. And I'm glad that this morning's plenary panel, there was a mention of Pope Francis's encyclical, Laudato Si, on the care of our common home. But the theme of that encyclical, it's about reconciliation of God, creation, and humanity. So when we're talking about climate change, it's important to keep in mind that it's not just about the environmental issues, but it's also about how we all need to come together, right, and continue to work very hard into creating a reconcilable environment and culture. So, finally, I was going to have a guest. His name is Jesus Ivan Melendez. Mr. Melendez, he was a business owner in Puerto Rico, and before Hurricane Maria, He was the owner of a beauty school, and before Hurricane Maria, they had like close to 150 individuals who have registered for the upcoming semester to take courses. Right after Hurricane Maria, his registration dropped to close to 25. So he's been forced to be displaced into Florida because, again, it's not just an environmental issue, as we saw from the pictures and as we have been discussing all throughout this conference. It is more of an issue about sustainability from the standpoint of, economic sustainability, job creation, and job maintenance. So this particular individual, Mr. Melendez, now is in the process of moving to Florida because a lot of his clients and customers were forced to be displaced to the state of Florida because the Hurricane Maria came at a time when there were so many challenging situations economically in the island that a lot of these people couldn't find jobs and couldn't maintain the jobs that they had. So, again, climate change is really a human and a humanitarian issue, a human rights issue. And the question is, how do we respond, church organizations, educational institutions here, like Loyola, the scientific community, our political leaders to solve this issue. It's a complex issue, but I think we need to continue to send the message and to be resilient in ensuring that we encourage a sustained dialogue, bringing all these concepts together, bringing the concept of environmental concerns as well as humanitarian concerns.
Well, I'd like to say thank you to all of our panelists, and we'd like to entertain some questions. As you ask your questions, please let us know who you are, and let us know if you have someone specific that you want to address the question to. So we have a microphone. Is anyone with, here we go, there's one in front here, Ray.
Hi, my name is Evan Geisart. I'm from Creighton University, and this is more directed towards the anthropological side of things. So we know that there's like this planetary boundaries concept where we're pushing certain parts of the planet to basically catastrophic limits. Are there any sort of cultural boundaries that you see that are going to play like a role in the effects of climate change? Or have you already seen some of them that we've crossed? I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Do these work? Yes. No. Okay, I give up. So, that's a very interesting question. I like that question a lot. And the first thing that comes to mind, there for probably 20 years we've been talking about the importance of biodiversity. And in the last 10 years, anthropologists have been talking about and others, the importance of biocultural diversity. So linking this also back to the understanding of indigenous and local knowledge. And these knowledge systems, if we think about the loss of languages on the planet, we lose a language every 2 weeks. And some people may say, well, let's just all speak English, it would be so much easier. But the problem with that, well, there's many problems with that, of course, but one of the big problems of that is that a language is like a museum of understanding, and that language is probably the best example that we have of culture. It's a symbolic form. If you think about it, what is language? It's our way of being able to articulate ideas that we would otherwise be pantomiming or acting out or finding some other way to communicate. And it's very sophisticated. And so the loss of languages is something that is a huge concern, because we're losing understandings of we're losing innovation. We're losing the ability to have a larger pool of adaptation. We're losing the ability to create and to imagine. So I have not heard of something that is like parallel in terms of the ecological concept of planetary boundaries. Like I said, that's a very interesting question. But I do know that cultural diversity is probably as important as biological diversity in terms of our ability to innovate and adapt and care for the world. Thank you for that question.
Hi, my name is Christine Pratt, and I'm with the Peggy Notebar Nature Museum, and I have been really moved by the stories that you've shared today, and it has me reflecting on conversations I hear frequently in the environmental movement about how we need to do a better job of capturing and sharing stories, because it is very compelling and does get at the humanity of our work. And so I'm wondering if any of you have advice on respectful ways to collect and share stories, or suggestions for resources for how we train people in this skill. I feel like we really are talking to each other about it a lot, but it's one of those things where we go, oh yeah, we should do that, and I'm not seeing the action that would accompany it.
Well, so yeah, this is something that's also very important to my work. There's a whole new expanding academic field called the environmental humanities. And this is about not only being interdisciplinary by integrating natural and social science, but also bringing humanities and expressive form. And I'm very interested in this because of my interest in finding many ways to communicate about climate change and how do we actually reach people. So here we have, if you were at the talk last night, it was, before the talk was this incredible performance by the choir and the dancers. And this is one example of a way to communicate to people about climate change. There's a group in Melbourne, Australia called Climb Art, CLIMARTE, and they do these installations all across the city every 2 years where they invite artists to come and do narrative and music and expressive forms. But if you just Google climate stories, you will find that there are many projects. The use of stories, of narrative, as we are seeing more signs of climate change in our own backyards in this country, people are starting to do this kind of sharing and interaction. The Sierra Club also had in its magazine, I think a few months ago, something about climate conversations, where they're actually getting people from opposite ends of the political spectrum to sit down with each other and just talk about change. And so they're showing that it's not a partisan issue after all, that there is a common language to be found about it. Yeah, I think you're on the beam as far as the power of stories and narrative, because we love it. The other thing I would do, when I was in Tasmania, in Hobart, there's an amazing museum there called the Museum of Old and New Art. And there was an installation about why do people have art, and this one of the 4 people who created an exhibit has written a book called The Origin of Stories. So he's taken this Darwinian approach. So the origin of species was Darwin's whole argument about humans and survival of the fittest. So this philosopher's approach is that we need art to survive, like we need food and water. So I suggest you look at that book, The Origin of Stories. His last name is Boyd. But that's a good point.
Hi, sorry, I can't see all speakers. My name is Erin Madsen. I'm a grad student in environmental policy at American University. My question is, so Dr. Craig gave us an example of
change on the eastern shore. I grew up in Southeast Virginia, so I'm a little bit aware of, the fact that the coastline has shifted, a lot over the last 100 years, with the example of like Hogshead Island disappearing within a generation.
Norfolk is having issues,
Sure.
big,
Norfolk,
big naval base.
But specifically, I'm wondering, that, shift, the history of shift, might not specifically be climate related in all of its aspects, given that, 100 years ago the shoreline was changing. And then shifting over to, I'm sorry, didn't catch your name.
Carlos.
Carlos, your example of, the historicity of, colonialism in Puerto Rico being, really critical to understanding how the impact of Hurricane Maria played out, disempowerment and, lack of resources and agency. So how does bringing climate change into these discussions, when possibly the root of the issue is in, and I wanted to mention, the larger issues of, rural decline and the loss of traditional knowledge, which is not necessarily climate related.
Mm-hmm.
How does bringing climate change into these issues improve the conversation, or, make it, help us address these underlying issues, versus can it be a hindrance to the conversation if climate change might be sort of a distraction from the other fundamental issues? Thank you.
Yeah, that would help, right? Yeah, we're having a little trouble with the microphones here.
Well, if you're referring to the issue in Puerto Rico, the colonial issue in Puerto Rico, I think that what's happening in Puerto Rico, there's two party lines. There's three. One is the people that are for the current status, political status, which is the Commonwealth, which is still maintaining a territory of the United States. The other one is for statehood, and the other one is for independence. I believe that what Hurricane Maria did to Puerto Rico in terms of the political discourse is that it has brought to light in all parties that the discussion of resolving the issue, the colonial status of Puerto Rico must happen and is a priority, because if people remember, there was, and CNN did a great report on this because they were actively reporting on this. There was aid that was coming to Puerto Rico from foreign countries. Well, there's the Jones Act. It can't come directly in a ship to Puerto Rico because it has to go to an American port, and then it has to be transferred to an American ship, and then come to Puerto Rico and increase to 20% the cost of whatever goods are being transported. In this case, they were donations. So the United States said, you can't have that. It's got to go to an American port. And so these decisions that could have been quickly made in Puerto Rico, should the colonial state have been resolved, could have avoided a lot of people from going hungry. There could have been much more of a global response, direct response to Puerto Rico. So I think that there's that kind of dialogue happening in Puerto Rico about what the need to come together on this issue. And it's sort of like what's happening in the United States, I think, where you have a new generation that wants to look at things very differently in the United States, right? And in terms of politics. I truly believe that we have another generation that's much more open-minded to discuss these kinds of issues, so that we can start getting resolutions to some of the things that impede Puerto Rico from further developing.
I'm going to stand up because I can't see most people. I just wanted to mention too that overall, so why climate change? Well, if you think about this concept of vulnerability, right, and what makes a community or a person or an island vulnerable, and it's not the people are weak, right? It's because of their specific demographic. It's because of their specific socioeconomic. It can be because of their race. It can become because of their class. And so here is citizens of the United States who are on an island who are being treated the way they're being treated. We can look at Katrina and think of the same and compare Katrina to Sandy. And how quickly did Sandy move forward as opposed to Katrina? So these are issues of vulnerability, and my understanding is that climate change is helping us to see these inequities very clearly. And as Carlos said, you know, I also am hopeful, like Gina McCarthy was, that we have young people, I mean, just the students who came out, who walked out for 17 minutes the other day. We've got young people who are savvy and articulate and are going to take this forward. And that's good, because we have a lot of changes that we need to make. So I personally don't think that climate change fogs up or messes up the conversation of what we're talking about. The opposite, I think, is true. It helps us to see these inequities and this disparity and this marginalization of populations clearly.
Very quickly, I think, you know, again, it's an effort of reconciliation of all these different spectrums, right? Not just the environmental spectrum, but also the political, social, economic impacts that climate change issues cause in society and in the world. So perhaps sometimes, you know, we're people that get very distracted by labels sometimes, and maybe, you know, engaging or starting a conversation from a political perspective, let's say in the case of Puerto Rico, you know, from the inequity that resulted about Puerto Rico's status, and then linking that into how this particular event in Puerto Rico brought up some of these inequities, perhaps is a way to address the conversation without initially distracting people because we're using the climate change, you know, label. Now, it's essential that we're clear and we're honest and we are, you know, assertive in ensuring that this is exactly what's happening. But sometimes, you know, maybe we need to be a little bit more strategic, if that's the word, to engage individuals in these conversations and know our audience. You know, if our audience are going to be distracted by some of these terms, perhaps we need to start the conversation on the political social side and then link and associate those issues with climate change and how are brought up possibly by climate change. So,
Anyone else on the panel or any audience members with additional comments, questions? I know it's all very clear now. Well, thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you at the poster session soon.